We are back now on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to preview another one of these games in Week 5 that kind of flew over my head, and I didn't know that it was going to take place already in this season in the NFL, but the first AFC North matchup, right? Being a Steelers fan, keeping track of all these games and matchups, this is going to be a good one for a couple of reasons, right? It's the first one of the year, and Baltimore will be traveling to Cincinnati in a big game for both of these teams, right? After coming off of big wins last year, the Ravens having a big statement win over the Buffalo Bills at home, the Bengals finally getting their first win of the season, albeit against the Panthers. It's a start. They need to get their first win somewhere relatively soon, so that was big for them. And now the Ravens enter with an even 2-2 record, and the Bengals enter this game 1-3. And why I wanted to highlight this matchup is because of the high stakes that come with it as well. Because potentially more than any other game this week, this one has the highest of stakes in my opinion. Because we're talking about if the Cincinnati Bengals win, they're going to be 2-3, same record as the Ravens, obviously, but they'd be able to jump ahead of them because they're 1-0 in the division rather than 0-1 like the Ravens would be, and it would be a big hit for the Ravens after their win against the Bills to now be in third place in the division and with, a losing record. That's pretty important, obviously. And then in the other way, for the Ravens to kind of keep stacking these wins to beat the Bills and then beat the Bengals on the road is a great way to build even more momentum, obviously, going forward. And also for the Bengals, if they were to lose, they'd be 0-1 in the division, obviously, and they'd be 1-4. And in this division, in the AFC as well overall, 1-4 is a very dire place to be. And it's not going to get too much easier as well for them based on that fact. So there's a lot at stake here. I truly believe that. We had Joe Burrow even saying this week at some point that he has to be darn near perfect against the Baltimore Ravens in this game. They're obviously feeling the attention, the pressure of this game, and that's why I think it's going to be such a must-watch game. So going into both of these teams, right, starting off with the Bengals, looking at some injuries that they're kind of dealing with. They have a knee injury to deal with for Mike Hilton. He's been listed as questionable. I know he didn't practice yesterday. I wasn't able to catch the injury reports on today. Trey Hendrickson is dealing with a neck injury. He's also questionable. And Jermaine Pratt dealing with another injury. He is also questionable right now. Those are big pieces on the defensive side of the ball. Clearly the weaker side for the Bengals. So hopefully all these guys can play because they're definitely going to need them. And even though their first win came last week against the Panthers, they finally at least got in the win column, right? That's the most important thing. After the first 3 weeks, to finally see yourself win a game is huge mentally, I think. After the first couple games, you felt that maybe you were wronged or that you just didn't play well. You came out flat against the Patriots, and then against the Commanders, you didn't maybe necessarily think you played bad. It's just that you maybe ran out of time. So all those things kind of take a toll on you. So to finally see a win in that column is huge for this team, I believe, going forward. And also, over the last 2 weeks, T. Higgins has been looking better. There's been more of an impact from him in the games, a little bit against the Commanders, but a lot more against the Panthers. And the running game is something that is slowly getting a lot of people's attention with Chase Brown and with Zach Moss. That seems to be the best piece of news from last week and also the game against the Commanders, that they did lose, but it was a positive sign for this team because there hasn't been a real running game to complement Joe Burrow in week 1 and week 2. But then in week 3 against the Commanders, they had 124 total rushing yards. They lost, but it is a better sign. Then they had 141 rushing yards total last week between Chase Brown and Zach Moss. So against the Ravens, you can't be one-dimensional. You just can't be all about Joe Burrow, all about Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins as well. They're not really going to get anywhere doing that. The more you can involve these running backs and the more you can have a well-balanced game like they had against the Chiefs, I think is going to bode much well for them in this matchup. And again, huge stakes, obviously, because of the record with a win and the record without a win. You could significantly get better and closer to these other teams, or really be further back from not only the division but the entire AFC. Not a lot of teams are or have four in the losing column already. I only believe it's the Jaguars up until now. A couple teams are 1-3, but you don't want to be grouped up with them. So now that's why this game matters so much for the Bengals. And now looking at the Ravens, they're coming in relatively healthy. They're not really dealing with too much in terms of injuries. All of their big name players should be good to go. And now it's crazy how this dynamic flips, right? Because before you had people sort of worrying them of what kind of team they were going to be, their identity, and whether or not, this Derrick Henry trade or scenario was really going to flourish as we believed it would be. But now, a couple weeks removed from that, we're talking about them being the best team in the NFL now, which is it's crazy, and it's awesome talking about the NFL and how everything switches from week to week. But still, yeah, it's just crazy how that whole narrative and idea has turned on the Ravens, and to their credit, right? Because they've made people change their mind now and realize that they're pretty much still the same team that they were last year, and they got better adding Derrick Henry. And now, off of that mention of Derrick Henry, you had the win last week, and not only last week against the Bills, but also against the Cowboys, and how dominant they were with that running game. It's made their defense look a lot better, and that's really what I loved seeing and taking away from those games, right? Because not only did the offense finally click, but also I was having my doubts about this defense a little bit, right? Why were they continuously giving up big leads? How did they lose to the Raiders? Were they going to let the Cowboys come back on them? It was looking a little bit shaky how easily teams were moving the ball on them, but I think finding this new method, idea with Derrick Henry and how much you use him throughout the entirety of the game, it's helped out their defense a lot. Kyle Hamilton's making some plays now more. Their corners are playing a lot better, shutting down all the Bills wide receivers last week. So I think those go hand in hand, very much so, with how this defense plays when they're running the ball very well, obviously, or how they look when their offense isn't really getting anything together and they're on the field a lot more often. So that's really what I love the most about watching the Ravens over the last 2 weeks. And also, the stakes for them, like I mentioned before, it's either go back to being under 500, or you get closer, one game away basically, to the Steelers, and potentially taking the lead away from them. So that's what each of these teams are playing for. And now, with that being said, we're going to look at some of the things that will determine this matchup, right? With some of the matchups directly. The first one being the Cincinnati defensive line, obviously going up against Derrick Henry. The Bengals are dealing with some injuries there. I don't know if their defensive tackle is necessarily going to play in this game. I know he's been out the last couple of weeks, so we'll see if he's able to play. Trey Hendrickson, I mentioned, has a neck injury, so whether or not he's going to play. Jermaine Pratt also is another one, very much going to be involved against Derrick Henry. So how do all those guys look, and are they able to make it to this game? And can they stop Derrick Henry is ultimately the question. That's going to be a huge matchup. Who's more successful in that? Then also, with the Bengals, predominantly, I think, still being a pass-first team, the matchup between T. Higgins and Jamar Chase going up against the Baltimore Ravens defensive backs like Nate Wiggins, Marlon Humphrey, and these guys, how do they match up well against them, and can they stifle them like they did last week against the Buffalo Bills? A lot, because their offense jumped up to a huge lead, so that kind of plays along with that factor. And also now, what I found also as a takeaway from that Bills game was the amount of pressure that Baltimore defensive line had on Josh Allen. They did a very good job of still keeping him contained and forcing him into a lot of difficult throws. He made a lot of them, but those are throws that you kind of just live with. So can they do the same with Joe Burrow now and make him uncomfortable, move the pocket for him, make him have lapses of judgment with pressure in his face and him just trying to get it away? All of those are going to be important factors in this game. And now, looking at some of the questions sort of that kind of transition off of these factors are which running game will be the more dominant and have the most time of possession. That's something I'm interested in seeing. While the Bengals are just now getting the running game going, Derrick Henry obviously and how well he's played so far is going to be fascinating how much the Bengals stick with the running game, how much do the Bengals stick with it if they find themselves down. All of that is going to be super interesting to watch. Then also, we have to mention the performances of Lamar and Joe Burrow, two of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Which quarterback is going to do enough or potentially more to kind of help their team in this game and kind of lead them to victory? We saw Joe Burrow play one of, if not his best game of the year against the Chiefs in that direct matchup against Patrick Mahomes, and they were the better team. They just kind of shot themselves in the foot with that last play. So can Joe Burrow do it again at home against Lamar? That's going to be really a good matchup to watch. And the last thing I'll be looking at is which team sort of goes out and proves the point. Which team wants to prove a point more and is successful in doing so. Essentially how each of these teams win is something I'm going to be looking at, right? Whether or not the Ravens can stack 2 wins against 2 good teams, or if the Bengals want this win bad enough to go out and shock everybody by beating the Ravens and close that gap, have the same record as them, and get closer and be in second place now actually in the division. Which one of these teams is going to want it more? But with that being said now, on my picks and who I think is going to win this game, I think I'm going to go with Baltimore because of my doubts with the Cincinnati Bengals defense. They allowed 104 rushing yards to Chuba Hubbard, 108 rushing yards total to the Washington Commanders, and 90 rushing yards to Isaiah Pacheco over the last 3 games. And all those guys are great. None of them are Derrick Henry, obviously, right? So, you got a different beast coming in here in Cincinnati, and you haven't been too successful against the other guys, so I can't imagine you're going to be better against a better running back and a run-heavy team. So that's really the main idea with this, and I just feel like the Ravens defense has kind of found themselves now after last week's performance, and holding the Buffalo Bills to 10 points, I think, was a resounding, turnout and statement made there. I like the Ravens defense obviously a lot more, and like Joe Burrow said, I feel like the Bengals have to be perfect in this game where it doesn't leave a lot of margin of error, and I think the Ravens are going to force them into spots where that margin of error, that discipline that they have is really going to be tested, and I just don't know if they're going to be able to keep it throughout the entire game and be perfect the entire game to muster out a win here. So with that, I feel like the Ravens just have a slight advantage off of their last win and how Derrick Henry looks. I'll take the Ravens in this game. Unfortunately, the Bengals will fall to 1-4, and with the easiest schedule in that division, it's shocking pretty much. But that's who I'm going with. And on that topic, on picking games, the last segment we have on today's show are some of my game picks for Week 5. We're going to go through about 6 games here to close out the show and tell you who I'm picking to win in this game and why that is. So make sure to stay tuned for this last segment. We'll be right back in just a few seconds.